Hello, everybody. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. And nice to have all of you here. And,
nice to be here, and it's good to be here.
Okay, thank you. 1 second. So everybody, hello, and again, welcome. Thank you for coming. And I'm very happy to basically be part of an evening and a program where I can't really tell you for certain what will be happening or what is happening. We're all dealing with the unknown. So some of what I will share with you will be known, but a lot of it is unknown. And like they say in Yiddish, my guess is as good as yours. And so I will allow opportunity for some discussion tonight. And because again, there isn't a lot of certainty on this issue or on this subject of post-pandemic Judaism, because there's a lot of speculation, a lot of thought, a lot of questions, and very few solid answers. I'll remind you that going back to March of 2020, so that is basically a year and 9 months ago, we shut down the Shul when the pandemic became real. And we shut down like mid-March. And we hesitated. We were going to say we were going to be canceling Shabbat services for 2 weeks. And we assumed we'd be resuming by the middle of April. And certainly by Pesach, we felt we'd be back in action. And to our, of course, great surprise, it was not 2 weeks, not 2 months, but virtually at this point, 2 years. And Ein L'Davar Sof, we don't yet see a clear end, and nobody in the world imagined how long this would be. And of course, we began to fumble to find ways of connecting. And we evolved into, with technology, into maintaining some kind of spiritual connection and service connection through Zoom and live streaming. That took us a bit of a while to transition. So for the first few months, there really was nothing. And, and until we were able to set up the technology and get used to it and figure it out. So it's been really interesting, as they say. Of course, personally, it's been even more interesting because it was also the time of winding down my professional active career, and which is actually fun, interesting to do, and not always easy to do when all of the points of connection of the previous 39 years were taken away, and we had to find new ways of connecting, which of course are imperfect. So life has been interesting for all of us, and we can all tell our stories. But I want to open with something that I'm going to share with you part of an article that was written by an individual named David Suissa. He lives in Los Angeles. He was born in Casablanca. He grew up in my hometown of Montreal, although I did not know him. His career was in advertising. He founded an advertising firm and a marketing firm in LA. But then he sort of transferred into Jewish journalism and is currently the editor of the Jewish Journal of Greater Los Angeles. And I'm going to share with you on the screen and read part of it with you out loud, an article, not bad, that he wrote in his own newspaper, which I think beautifully captures the questions that frame our evening tonight and basically deal with what awaits us when the pandemic is over, or when normalcy to a much larger extent has been restored. So I'm going to do a screen share. 1 second. Okay, here we go. Perfect. I hope you can all see this. But I will be reading part of it out loud, so you won't really have to see it. So this is David Suissa's article, which when I saw this, I said, this is my talk tonight. So I'm going to, as the intro, I'm going to share this with you. He writes, there's a difference between a phase and a trend. A phase comes and goes. A trend keeps growing. This is the vexing and transcendent issue right now in the synagogue world. Has COVID-19 triggered a phase or accelerated a trend? We know the many effects of the pandemic, such as reduced attendance in sanctuaries, the exponential growth of online, and a general preference for being outdoors. How permanent are these changes? And how will they impact the future of synagogues? Change is uncomfortable, but radical change is disruptive. It shakes you up. The disruption caused by the pandemic has shaken up synagogues. Among the rabbis and leaders with whom I've spoken, there's a general sense that synagogue life in America, let's say North America, probably throughout the world, has been altered, perhaps permanently. The root of this disruption is maddeningly simple. A deadly and contagious virus has made a lot of people afraid of enclosed spaces. Combined with the hassle of wearing a mask while praying and other restrictions, we shouldn't be surprised if synagogue attendance has been in sharp decline. What started with a lockdown of synagogues in mid-2020 evolved into a gradual reopening for the high holidays in 2021. But despite the high vaccination rates among Jews, many people are still nervous about attending services. For a synagogue world that has enshrined the brick and mortar model for well over a century and has built revenue models around people showing up, the reluctance to enter a sanctuary represents a mini earthquake. For most Jews, the decision to go to synagogue was never just about prayer. It came with a wonderful package, reconnecting with friends, hanging out at the Kiddush club, schmoozing during communal meals, bringing the kids, arranging and attending life cycle events, going to high holiday services, and so on. It's all those extras that bonded Jews to their congregations and made it easier to renew membership. Seemingly overnight, COVID fears and restrictions have significantly lowered the perceived value of the synagogue experience. It's true that this trend was prevalent before COVID. Much has been written in recent years about the need to revitalize the traditional synagogue model, but the pandemic has dramatically accelerated that trend. In the non-Orthodox world where technology is allowed during Shabbat and holidays, the magic of digital has come to the rescue, but as a double-edged sword. The extraordinary convenience of online services has increased virtual attendance, but it has also discouraged in-person attendance. It's hard to compete with the comfort of virtually attending services from your living room, especially when you tell yourself it's the safer route. How many of these comfortable souls will return to synagogue even after COVID is officially behind us and they no longer need to pray with a mask? And we can add parenthetically, of course, especially when a service is live streamed, as it is at Beth David on Shabbat and Yom Tov, when nobody sees you, doesn't matter what you're wearing or what you're not wearing. Doesn't matter if you're drinking coffee, having breakfast, having lunch, whatever you're doing, it doesn't matter because nobody sees you. When we're on Zoom during the week, it's a bit tougher because then you can kind of be seen unless you blank your screen, which people do. But we know that there is a comfort to technology, which of course does not exist in the Orthodox world, as David Suissa has pointed out. So much of this is a question of degree. If, for example, a sanctuary that usually has 500 attendees now only has 100, and with us, we would say that on a typical Shabbat before the pandemic, if there was no simcha, we'd have at least 150 people, maybe up to 250 in peak season. And with a simcha, we could easily have 350 or 400. Obviously, now we're down without a simcha to 30 or 40 on Shabbat. It's gotten a bit better. It was on a Shabbat, it was very low at the beginning when we were first allowing Shabbat attendance. It was just barely a minyan. When there's something special going on with a simcha or bringing the congregation of Bina into the shul or something, so it increases, of course, but it's not what it was, of course. The numbers are much smaller. At what point does reduced attendance and reduced memberships become decisive issues that must be addressed? Put it bluntly, at one point does a sanctuary become too empty and a building become too big for the people it is serving? In the modern Orthodox world, because technology is not allowed on Shabbat and holidays, people are returning to sanctuaries, but others have gravitated to backyard minyans, or in Toronto, garage minyans, which are more casual and intimate. How many of those comfortable souls will return indoors to a traditional membership model? The ultra-Orthodox, the Black Hat, the Haredi segment is a different story. In that world, prayer inside a synagogue has always been central and immutable, pandemic or no pandemic. But while that segment has avoided disruption to its synagogue model and lived with the risks and consequences, and the writer is being polite and many have disregarded the regulations, they represent a small minority. The vast majority of North American synagogues are looking at an uncertain future, full of possibilities, yes, but also full of anxieties. Remarkably, what we took for granted only 2 years ago, people showing up at synagogues, has turned into a huge challenge. It would be wrong to approach this challenge with the simplistic question, how do we save our Jewish buildings? A more appropriate question might be, how do we save our Judaism? First, the good news. We're going through a golden age of learning, of Jewish learning. Advances in digital technology have opened up an enormous educational vista for anyone with an iPhone. Just as the convenience of online has hampered in-person attendance, it has also led to arguably the greatest surge in Jewish learning in our history. Imagine if this pandemic had taken place 30 years ago, when there was no technology, no internet, no live streaming, no smartphones, and people couldn't gather together. Imagine how catastrophic that would have been. The prevalence of digital technology, as high as it is today, though, will only grow with time. But here's the problem. The same convenience that seduces users also seduces leaders. I've spoken to many rabbis, he never spoke to me. I've spoken to many rabbis who are in awe that they now reach people around the world. When your audience is unlimited around the globe, it's easy to forget your audience down the block. And many people access, there are certain very powerful shuls with enormous budgets that have wonderful Shabbat and Yom Tov services. One service with which I assume many of you are familiar in New York City, they have the musical accompaniment of the New York Philharmonic. Three professional cantors, an unbelievable technological service. I've been told they have a video setup that is in the neighborhood between $500,000 and $1 million. We're talking US funds, of course. And we don't have quite that budget at Beth David, somewhat less than that. But they have state-of-the-art technology, network quality television, broadcasting their services, attracting a worldwide audience. And this one synagogue in particular, I understand on an average Shabbat is reaching between 10 and 20,000 people worldwide. That is quite incredible. But the problem becomes, as one of our members shared with me, they've been to that service. They think it's beautiful, but it's not theirs. They don't feel it's not the shul there that they've been going to. So they'd rather come to our shul with much less technology. It's not so fancy. There's no New York Philharmonic or Toronto Symphony Orchestra accompanying the cantor. It's not that it's much simpler, but on the other hand, it's not home. It's not what it's not their home shul. So Beth David is the home shul, and they'd rather have that without the technological advances. But it's challenging, of course. So that I'm just trying to wait 1 second. I have to, okay. Down the block, in other words, neighborhood shul, is where communities live and breathe. You can reach millions online, maybe not millions, but thousands. What good is that to the hundreds of families in your area who are still isolated? It does feel like an impossible conundrum. If people are reluctant to congregate inside enclosed places and prefer to experience services either on Zoom or outdoors, how can you bring them back to enjoy the delicious fruits of communal gatherings? We can address the issue of safety without losing sight of the big picture. The soul of a community is defined by physical attendance. It's quite possible, of course, that no matter what we do, the pandemic will lead to synagogues merging, heard about that before, or closing, subleasing their space, or reducing their overheads. But that kind of restructuring, however necessary, should not be a substitute for the creativity that is required to adapt to our new era. You might have noticed that I've refrained from offering any suggestions for online strategies. That's because virtually every synagogue is already doubling and tripling down on virtual technology. They don't need me to tell them about the magic of online. They've done such a good job. Many of us are nearing Zoom overdose. As they say in Yiddish, ausgezumt. Right now, it seems as if many synagogues are caught in a perfect storm. Safety paranoia has led to an online isolation, which has led to communal decline. That decline includes loss of revenue and memberships. Most people are not willing to pay for anything online because so much of it is already free. Entering physical spaces for obvious reasons has a much higher perceived value. The good news, and he doesn't say it here, but also when you enter a physical space, there's food. It's hard to get that online. But the good news is that what is good for the revenue is also good for the soul. Human beings love to congregate. We love to gather with friends. We love the warmth and intimacy of community. We don't just love it, we need it. This need has only been magnified by a stubborn pandemic that has isolated too many people. When synagogues were in lockdown and physical proximity was not an option, connecting online was a lifesaver. But now that the world is reopening, we can't allow the virtual space to keep us isolated. Synagogues must use digital technology not as a final destination point, but as a gateway to bring more people back together in real physical spaces. Jewish identity is only strengthened when people meet in person, at an event, prayer service, at a Shabbat table. It's crazy that one even needs to mention this, but it's a sign of how far we've gone down the virtual highway that we must remind ourselves that it's really important to meet in person. Synagogues can and should be the communal antidote to everything virtual. They should be the source and the last bastion of real human connections. Not to diminish the value and power of the digital world, online learning will continue to thrive. Digital will continue to play a huge role in our lives. Nothing will slow that runaway train. For better or for worse, we're all creatures of habit. The more we live online, though, the more we'll increase our communal isolation and get too comfortable with it. It's a line we're never to cross when we lose our taste for the delicious fruits of communal gatherings. What kind of Jewish golden age will it be if many of us end up living it virtually? I can only imagine that in the wake of that disaster, it must have been difficult for our ancestors when the Second Temple was destroyed to see any hope. How could they? The concrete core of their tradition was ripped apart, but we overcame destruction by being creative, resourceful, and resilient, focusing not on real estate, but on soul estate. We carried the holiness and rituals of the temple with us throughout the diaspora, in our homes, our Shabbat tables, in our houses of prayer and learning. We survived by staying connected to our tradition and to one another. The Talmud describes, I'm deviating from the article, and the Talmud describes how when the temple was destroyed, when the Second Temple was destroyed, people despaired But what happened was the rabbis had the ingenuity to create the prayer structure and to make the synagogue the center of prayer, of activity, when there was no longer a sacrificial altar. And that became what sustained us through the millennia of diaspora and kept Judaism alive. We not only survived the loss of the altar, the temple, we improved upon Judaism by making it something that was really obtainable by every human being, didn't require going to Yerushalayim for pilgrimage or going to the Holy Temple to offer a sacrifice when that was the only place where they were permitted, but to every Jew was able, in a sense, to have his own altar, his own private ability to pray at home through prayers that the rabbis, after the destruction of the temple, constructed, and of course, in the synagogue prayer service. The deadly COVID pandemic has shaken the concrete core of our modern temples. The rise of a miraculous technology that keeps people physically apart has further shaken our human connections. In the midst of such disruption, it's hard to see the upside. But if our history is any guide, we always figure things out. If we've recovered from our last earthquake, we can recover from this one. Not by doubling down on virtual technology that keeps us physically isolated, but by imagining and creating human spaces as antidotes to virtual living. Human spaces where Jews can safely gather to pray, learn Torah, and celebrate and dance and flourish together, and even give each other real hugs. If we give it our best, most creative and resourceful shot, we might even end up with a richer and more inspiring Judaism. And that will be a trend, not a phase. Okay, end of long article with my interspersed commentary. I want to discuss it a bit with you, and then I want to share a couple of other, not articles, but a couple of other interesting notations, focusing on the dilemma in which we find ourselves, where the Jewish world is today, and where we imagine we're going to be when this is mostly over. And I think the questions that David Swisser raises are all really the questions that frame what I want to talk about tonight, and the questions that have perplexed all of us, and he beautifully brings it all together in his piece. The question becoming, that virtual Judaism, it's a blessing and a curse. And the blessing being, of course, that without it, these last 2 years, we would have really suffered much more than we have. But the curse part being, how do we break back into normalcy? How do we manage to find a way of returning when that becomes possible, when that becomes safe? And I understand that, I share it. It's really hard at this point, I think, until public spaces such as synagogues will no longer require masks. When we're able to, I think we'll see a larger return. When we're able to return normalcy to Kiddush, and probably will require a substantial upgrade of Kiddush. It's been upgraded over these last few years, but that will require even more intensity, because there's no question, because part of people coming to Shul, I would say, let's put it this way. My 40 years of pulpit experience at Beth David taught me that not everybody who comes to Shul regularly is coming only to fulfill the halachic requirement of tefillah b'tzibur, of public prayer in a minyan. There are many who are, and are happy to do so, and love to daven, but that's not the only thing that brings us to Shul. When we've come back to Shul, and the only thing we're allowed to do is to daven, and everything else is restricted, including interaction. In the first weeks when we had in-house minyanim on Shabbat, I was already retired at that point, but when it was happening, people had to be seated separate. You couldn't talk to anybody. You couldn't look at anybody. You couldn't, God forbid, shake a hand. And it was tough. And then people weren't interested, because clearly a huge driver in terms of public worship, of synagogue worship, is the social aspect, the community. Beit Knesset means it's the house of gathering. Synagogue is not primarily known as a Beit Tefillah, a house of prayer. It is a Beit Tefillah. But if you look up synagogue in a dictionary, in a Hebrew English dictionary, the translation is going to be Beit Knesset, house of gathering. where we gather together. So the primary function is to bringing community together. And one of the things we do when we're together is because it's a Beit Tefillah, it's a house of prayer. It's a Beit Limud, it's a house of study. It's basically, it is a lot of things. It's not simply a place of prayer. And that's why it's been tough for people to want to come back. And that's one of the dilemmas we have. How do we restore that community? And let's be honest here. And I'm going to look at a couple of other sources with you. Let's be honest with you. I tried most of the time to be honest. And I will soon give you a chance to interact. Let's be that one of the aspects of synagogue, one of the aspects of synagogue that is most challenging is finding the way to bring people together and create that purpose. But the honesty requires me to say that these problems did not start with the pandemic. The pandemic was an accelerant. But if we go back 2.5 years, this is where my honesty comes in, attendance was already on the decline. We saw it. Not only at Beth David, in every shul. Numbers were not as great. And the percentage of young people was diminishing. I mean, our crowds tended to be old for a long time, older. Everyone here is young, of course. But young people, under 40s in general, including in the Orthodox world, and we're going to go into that in a few moments, are not attracted to shuls. Shul is not a thing that young people are doing. And that's pre-pandemic. The whole idea of synagogue was in decline prior to this. We were seeing numbers decline, and synagogues were having merger discussions well before the pandemic. That was it accelerated, but it didn't start with it. It just made things more immediate. A trend that may have taken 5 to 10 years is taking 3 to 5 or 2 to 5 years. It's quicker. Because all of a sudden, when the ability to come to shul is diminished dramatically, at the beginning totally cut off and now slowly beginning to return, it accelerated the process that had already begun before. When we were seeing that in this hyper-technological age, people were already moving away from public worship, public gathering. A lot of these things were in decline before. And this is a story that we hear. If you look at, I'm going to share with you some of the Pew study of the American Jewish community, which again is focused on the US Jewish community, but largely applies to Canada with some difference, but not much. So I'm going to show a bit of that with you soon. I'm going to share a bit of that with you soon. But we're going to see that, go back to the previous study. There was a 2021 study that I'm going to share with you, a little part of it. The study in 2014 already showed the same trends of younger participation across the board, not simply in conservative shuls like everybody likes that, across the board, and lesser participation of young people who are already gravitating away from synagogue models. So this is not something that began with the pandemic. It's something that the pandemic has accelerated dramatically, but it was already there to begin with. That's something that we need to keep in mind. By the way, I saw there was some in the chat, and Alan and others have asked if they can have copies of the, I will be happy later to make that available to you, the copies of the article. I can't put it on right now, but I will be happy to make it available to you after the lecture. So one other thing I'm going to write, then I'm going to open up to questions, but I want to share with you something really interesting. I hope that what I've done now hasn't been tremendously non-interesting, but I want to share with you something else that briefly, this is going to be much briefer. I'm going to share again. 1 second. Okay. 1 second. Okay. Yeah. Okay. This is a very brief portion of an article in the Jewish World magazine, which is the magazine of the OU, the Orthodox Union. So centrist, or they don't like the term modern Orthodoxy, but the centrist Orthodox organization. And the writer of this piece is a rabbi who I adore. Rabbi, he's known as J.J. Schachter, Dr. Jacob Joseph Schachter. Brilliant rabbi. If you ever have a chance to watch him, a lecture of his online, grab it, because he's terrific. So I'm just going to read tiny parts here that are highlighted. It's something really interesting. And addressing challenges in the Orthodox world, kind of the modern centrist Orthodox world, not the ultra-Orthodox world, not the Haredi world. But he says, this is what he says. Yeah, his opening is delicious. He starts, when I was a little boy, my parents spoke to me only in Yiddish. I remember they told me a story more than once, or was it a joke? But all I can recall is the punchline, "Oibus is azoy git, verwus is azoy schlecht." If things are so good, why are they so bad? So what he's looking at the Pew study, which I'm going to share with you in a moment. And he says that this, the Pew Research Center, they do all these studies on everything, but they've done this very serious study of the Jewish world. And they found that 3% of American Jews above the age of 65 self-identify as Orthodox, 7% between 50 and 64, but it goes to 17% between the ages of 18 and 29, which is much higher than in any other denomination. So that's good news. The young demographic are identifying as Orthodox in a much higher percentage than the older people. So that is very good for the future. So all people in the Orthodox world were dancing horrors. They said, yay, look at this. We have a great future because we have the highest numbers of people who are young who are identifying with us. Again, it's only 17%, but it's still better than 7% or 3%. Now, so we say, okay, so that's wonderful. It's great. That's the good part. But then he says, it's not so good for the rest of us. So if we jump down here, he says that the current study, the following data shows that those who self-identify Orthodox, look at these statistics, 14% of the Orthodox, those who identify as Orthodox, do not report that religion is important to their lives. 5% do not report that being Jewish is somewhat important to them. 25% do not report that their religious faith provides them with a great deal of meaning and fulfillment. 17%, and these are people who identify as Orthodox, do not report that observing Jewish law is essential to being Jewish. 31% do not report that being part of a Jewish community is essential to being Jewish. 23% do not report that they often mark Shabbat in a way that is meaningful to them. 9% do not report that it is very important to them that any potential grandchildren are Jewish. It's Orthodox. 17% report in the Orthodox community that they attend synagogue a few times a year or less. And so Rabbi Schachter says, and I'm just going to quote a tiny bit more with you, I don't know how to interpret these numbers. What, in fact, does it mean to consider oneself Orthodox? But most disturbing and upsetting to me is the finding in this study that 33% of Jews raised as Orthodox do not continue to identify with Orthodoxy as adults. That 1/3 of those people raised as Orthodox are no longer Orthodox when they're adults. And he's very concerned about that. So you can see, and this is again, source in the Orthodox world. Again, we have our own source, and we will look at that now. But it's just fascinating that we're seeing this fact in Orthodoxy, and so an honest observer here, like Rabbi Schachter, is saying, don't injure yourself patting yourself on the back because of our successes compared to other movements, because we are also a tsuris. So now I'm just showing you quickly, and we'll go back, then I'll open up for conversation, a couple of examples from the Pew study. If you Google Pew Research Center study of the Jewish world or Pew Jewish survey, you can download a report that's like 260 pages. It's a PDF of 260 pages. I'm not sharing that with you. I downloaded it. I'm just sharing you 3 pages of it. But if you want to read this in intensity, it's fascinating. Again, it's the American Jewish community. I'm not so sure that it's so different here. Canada is often described as one generation behind the American community. In other words, one generation closer to European or North African roots, depending where we come from in our heritage, but we're kind of on the same path. We're not so different as we sometimes think that we are. So here you're seeing now in the Pew report how the likelihood of American Jews attending religious services regularly or believing in God, etc. They compare Jewish adults to all US adults. Religion is very important to them. All Jewish adults, 41%, Jewish adults, 21%. So half as many, it's, half the percentage of Jews as compared to non-Jews, as compared to the total American population, consider religion important to them. That should be concerning. Somewhat important, it's a tie, 26, 25%. Not important, not too important, not important at all. We win this, the Gewalt. 53% of Jews think religion is not too or not at all important to them. Only 34% of the totality of Jewish adults. Attending religious services weekly, we're 12%, they're 27%. Once or twice a month, it's a tie, 8%. A few times a year, we win, 27% versus 15%, because they're already attending every week. Seldom or never, it's a tie, where we slightly win, 52 versus 50. Believing in the God of the Bible, half as many Jews do as the general population, 26% versus 56%. Believe in a higher power outside of God, we win that. More of us, the 50% of Jews believe there's a higher power, only 33% of the general population. We do not believe in any power. We also do double of the regular. So that's, I don't know what to make of that, but clearly one can legitimately be concerned about Jewish connection versus the general connection. So, and now jumping to Orthodoxy, this is what drove Rabbi Schachter to distraction. Now, so 2/3 of Americans raised as Orthodox Jews still identify as Orthodox as adults. And that's a statistic that shocked Rabbi Schachter, and I suspect will shock a lot of people, both Orthodox and non-Orthodox, because one makes the assumption that Orthodox Jews stay Orthodox. There may be a few drop down, but that is not. So if Orthodox Jews, now those who are Jewish today, 67% remain Orthodox, 10% become conservative, 10% become Reform, 6 no branch, 1 some other branch, and 6% leave Judaism. That's shocking. Conservative Jews, 2%. Not a lot of conservative Jews are becoming Orthodox, according to in the American community. I think it's higher in Canada than this. 2% become Orthodox, 41% remain conservative. So that's, of course, a concern for the conservative movement of losing half of its adherents. 30% become Reform. I believe it's a lower number in Canada as well. It's not 30%. Because again, I think in the American Jewish community, conservative Jews consider themselves much closer to Reform. I think in our community, conservative Jews consider themselves closer to Orthodoxy. Let's say Shar Shemaim Orthodoxy, not necessarily Bo Shul Orthodoxy. 15% no particular branch, 3% some other branch, 7% non-Jewish, 1% higher than in the Orthodox world. Reform, they keep more of their adherents. 88% start, you go to 66% stay Reform, 4% become conservative, only 1% become Orthodox, 12% leave Judaism. And then, okay, so that gives you the idea of the Jewish future. It affects everybody. Again, the least is Orthodox, but even there, in the most committed communities, we're losing adherents. And this is, again, this does not really reflect, understand, this really does not reflect the pandemic. The pandemic is an accelerant, but this is all stuff. This study was done mostly prior to the pandemic, or at its very beginning. This would have been done in the earlier part of 2020, and maybe even going on to 2019, 2020. So the pandemic has impact here, but this really reflects a reality that was already in place well before that. So another concern that I have, and I'm actually not going to show you this in study, but I do get concerned with this study in the US, and I think it's different in Canada, about level of attachment to Israel. And I'm going to drop the share here because I want to get to see you and you to see me. But I want to basically just share, and in a few minutes I will open to questions. One of the, we have to look for what are the ways that people connect to Jewish life. Synagogue is very important, but there are other communal ways to connect. I think very high on that list is Israel. And we've also seen a diminution of connection to Israel very much in the American community, where younger people feel much less close to Israel. And a rather astoundingly high percentage of young people, in particular under 50s, have said that Israel means very little to them. I think that's one of the places where Canada is quite different than the US, and we have a much higher percentage of people that are committed to Israel, because we know that there are a lot of Jews who don't connect through synagogue necessarily, but many, many connect through Israel. Whether it's travel to Israel when that's possible, or other ways identifying with Israel. But that is an area where we see in the younger population, more in the US than here, young people not connecting and many young people not being supportive of Israel. And we talked about that a bit 2 weeks ago when we looked at these rabbinical students who wrote the letter, this letter of 90 rabbinical students, mostly Reform and some conservative, no Orthodox, but basically very critical of Israel after the war last year. And that really scandalized many of us. The idea of that level of commitment, and that really scares us more than people not coming to synagogue, because if that identification is lost, then what does any kind of Jewish connection mean in the future? So I'm going to, at this point, ask people to who have comments or questions, please I want to hear from you, because you've heard from me for 40 minutes. That's genug. Again, I'm not giving sermons every week, so I feel the need to talk for 10 hours. But when I see you're either laughing or crying as I say that, not the crying that I'm not giving sermons, but crying that you have to listen to me for 10 hours. So like wave, if you know how to do an electronic hand, do that. If you know how to do okay, I see it's, here we go. You can unmute yourselves, okay? So I'm asking you to unmute. So is that Alan who wants? Is that
it's Lorraine, actually.
Lorraine? Okay, Lorraine. So
yeah.
Go ahead.
While you were talking, my understanding is because of the extreme circumstances, technology was allowed for Shabbat and holidays. Is it now a given that that's where we are and that's where we're staying?
That is an amazingly good question, and I think a lot of us are wrestling with that. I would say that most of us feel that there needs to be some moving back from technology. In other words, I understand that, I had a conversation with Rabbi Morrison this week at Beth Emet, and they're more right-wing than we are. They're, more closer to Orthodox than we are in their practice, as we know. But their policy has been, their decision is, they've returned as of this week to having live daily minyanim. Every minyan now is live. Only one, they used to have two, they have one, but every morning is a live minyan in Shul. And they've basically stopped Zooming, and they're live streaming every service, but no more Zoom. And I think and their thought, and that's echoed in other communities, is that once we're able to return to live minyanim, people being in the building, we want to diminish the amount of electronic in gathering. Otherwise, people won't come back. But on the other hand, we recognize there are people who aren't going to come to Shul, whether they're not able to physically, or they're just not going to come. At least having a camera on live stream, which can be left on and doesn't have to violate Shabbat, that can continue, and that undoubtedly will continue. I no longer, make policy at Beth David. So I can sleep better at night. I no longer make policy at Beth David, and I'm kind of lucky not to have to do it right now. But I suspect what I understand that will happen eventually, once more people are coming to Shul, there'll also be a pulling back of live streaming, of Zoom. I suspect, but I can't guarantee that for sure. And more live streams, people who can't come will be able to be part of the service, but the encouragement will be to come to Shul. And if you don't somehow turn back the knob a bit on technology, you're not going to be able to encourage people to come back to Shul. So it's a tough challenge, and everybody's wrestling with it. But I think have to some return to closer to what it was. But once the barn door has been opened, it will never be shut totally. There'll always be some technology. By the way, we were talking about setting up a camera before the pandemic because we knew there were a lot of people who were not able to come to Shul, people whether in nursing homes, people who physically could not, who were not well enough to come to Shul, but who would love to have been part of the service. And now that they're able to be part of a service, to watch it, and their grandchildren set up the technology for them, they can watch it. We can't now turn that off and deprive them of it. It would be wrong, it would be unfair. But we also want to do the maximum to encourage people to want to be back in a communal space once that is totally safe. And God willing, that will happen soon in our day. Bim Rabbi Yameinu, as we say in Hebrew. But so that's a great question. We don't have the full answer now, but I do believe there will be a somewhat of a turn back to the way it was, but we will never totally go back to the way it was, because we really can't. That barn door has been open. It would be like saying, for example, then I'll look for the next question. It would be like saying, for example, that we've decided, we're no longer going to be egalitarian. It was a good for 10, 12 years, 15 years. It was fun. People liked it, but we have a new board, a new ritual committee, don't like it anymore, want to go back to be more traditional. So we're no longer, can't do that. There is no case in human history, as far as I know, where that has happened. Once you, and it shouldn't happen, but I'm saying theoretically, if one were to make that case, you can't do that anymore. You would destroy the truth. I mean, what happens in those cases sometimes is there are breakaway minyanim, people that are not happy with, a liberal trends, will start a new shul, and that's happened. That happened. It did happen at Beth David. We didn't have a breakaway minyan, but it's happened in other situations in the past. But there's certain, and the same way here, there'll always be some intrusion of technology, which is a good intrusion, but I suspect there'll be some lowering of the temperature of technology in order to encourage people to come back to real life. I think, another way, as I've said before, semi-facetiously, but I think it's true, that will also mean really having to have a bang-up kiddush and a really good minyan breakfast in order to encourage people. Because I'll be honest, that's an attraction. I would come out of my office when I was still working. I'd come out of my office when there was still live minyanim. I go to the minyans. I used to go to the 8 o'clock minyan. I didn't get like getting up that early to go at 7 o'clock, which is, and I would go to 8 o'clock minyan. I would go back and then go to my office after the minyan. I would say hello at the breakfast, but I wouldn't stay. But I would not say come back. We'll go back for a cup of coffee or something at 10:30 in the morning. There was still a table of people there. I hadn't left for 2 hours. It was wonderful. People were spending one table. We had a man's table. They were all arguing politics. And some of them are no longer with us. We miss them deeply. And we had a primarily women's table with a couple of exceptions who were not discussing having political arguments per se. But you all remember, some of them were at those tables, and they continued often for very long discussion. It was amazing. You came to Dublin and you came early. You came earlier than I did for me. It's not hard to do. But you stayed and you didn't go home unless you had to. People stayed for a long time. So that was amazing. And that, I think, will bring people back, because you miss that. You can't really do that on Zoom. I mean, as much as you love Zoom and you say hi to everybody and you look great, and you don't have to wear pants, all that stuff is wonderful. But at some point, you want to have that social aspect. Is so important. Now we realize how much it's missing. And certainly David Suisse in his article beautifully highlighted that's really a critical element. And that's really the magic that works. Okay, any other questions or comments? So, I'm talking too much. Wave or yell or, unmute you. Okay, Janice, please.
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what you've said. I look at things, though, a little bit differently. And what I'm looking for and what I didn't find before COVID, and I'm not finding it now, is the joy, the joyousness of Shabbat, the joy of bringing in Shabbat together. The first time I went on Zoom with Beth David, I was very upset actually to see the plexiglass barriers in front of you and in front of the cantor when there were no Jews in the pews anyway. So it just seemed to me that that was a physical barrier that wasn't necessary, but maybe was typical of many conservative shuls. I think we are glad to know that the technology will continue post-COVID. I think it is wonderful for those of us who find it difficult to get to shul, physically. But I miss on the other hand, I miss the community. I miss the physicality. And, I hope that there can be, hybrid or some very innovative solutions to all of this. But I appreciate the fact that you're working on it and that rabbis I know around the world are working on it. I just, people want to be in a place that they're emotionally attracted to. And people like to be happy. And I think we, as a conservative movement, have to maybe take a page out of Chabad, God forbid, but take a page and celebrate Shabbat, really celebrate it and be happy. And that then changes, we can do all the davening, we need the Philharmonica, we just need smiles. And we just need to really do an extra Shechechianu at times, to celebrate things. We need to, for me, I need a happier Shabbat service.
I think that's a wonderful comment, Janice. And I just thought specifically on the plexiglass, the difficulty, they're not easy to move. I mean, so you're right. When there was nobody there, that we didn't need them, but it was, that would require they're pretty massive structures, and they're also it's not a simple task to take them down. It's not something that we could just push them aside. One of the ones in the lower level, yeah, could be, but I would welcome the day when masks won't be necessary and that won't be necessary. Part of the reason is it's really difficult. And it would have been, when I was doing high holiday services, which is the last services that I've done at Beth David, when I was doing high holidays, I could not run a 4-hour, 3.5-hour service masked. First of all, because then I can't see because my glasses fog up. I could not do it. And that's part of the challenge. The only way we could do it when we have people who are leading unmasked, because it's really hard when you're masked, especially if you wear glasses. But that is, when that is no longer, I think it'd be great. I would love to celebrate taking down those barriers. But that's an interesting point. But it's more logistical. It's not right. Those weeks when we couldn't have anybody in shul, it could have been removed. But
all you need to do is block off the first 2 or 3 rows of the sanctuary.
Okay. Well, I mean, again, I no longer said policy.
I know.
One of the joys of my retirement, and it's parts of it a bit difficult, but the real joy of my retirement is it's not my problem.
I get that.
I don't have to, it's not my, other people have to make those decisions now, and I can just sit back and say, okay, have a good time. So there's a dream factor to having this issue now, but when I don't have to be the one making these difficulties. But no, it's a valid point, and I will. That's feedback that I think I'll be happy to pass on to those who are more responsible not to make these very difficult life decisions. Okay, I'm going to look for if there are other comments or questions or opinions. I'm looking through. I'm at the screens. I'm going through. I mean, I can only do for those who are screened, who have their cameras on. So let me then. If at the moment we seem to have no further comments. So let me. Anna, did you want to? Are you adjusting your? Oh, your hand is up. Perfect. Anna, go ahead.
I'm one of those people who I do appreciate having the Zoom. Now, I used to go to Shul pretty regularly on Shabbat.
Yep.
Not go for mincha. Very, 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 very seldom. Very, very, very seldom would I go for an 8 o'clock minyan. However, since we've got Zoom, I am more likely to attend services at those times. I don't do it all the time, but there are times when I've, done a few in a row. So I'm more likely if I don't have to actually go in person because it's difficult. So I appreciate Zoom very much so. And that
Okay.
way I also see people, I can talk to them too.
Well, that will, I mean, certainly during, that will continue either Zoom or live stream. I'm sure that there'll be a continuation of that. I don't think that's going to go away. I don't see any reason for that to go away. But again, part of it will be finding a way to incentivize coming to Shul, because it's going to be necessary to rebuild minyanim. We're going to, the first week we had one service of those whose memories go back a long, a year, almost 2 years. The one Shabbat after the pandemic, we really realized there was a problem. I remember, it's funny because the Thursday before this happened, we were at one of the last showings of Hamilton, downtown, of course, the Mergers Theater. I should parenthetically say I'm one of the 2 people on the planet who didn't like Hamilton. And that was prior to the pandemic. And I am almost embarrassed to say it. Everyone says it's the most great play. I was bored out of my skull.
I didn't like it.
I mean, that's another story. That's not the topic of this. We're not doing theater reviews here. It came on, the movie came out. I'm not interested in why. I thought it was boring and I didn't like the music. I didn't like anything about it. I hated Hamilton and everyone loves it. So I think there's something wrong with me, but that's beside me. That was the last crowd I was in. It was packed. And, there was already, that was in the, I was at APAC a week and a half before in Washington. And that became a spreader event where there was a Jew from Toronto who had the virus, a member of Beth Shalom, the president of Beth Shalom congregation. I had lunch at APAC with the cantor of Beth Shalom, Cantor Moses, at APAC. And then I found out that Cantor Moses had to go into quarantine for 2 weeks because he was in direct contact with someone who had the virus. I called my doctor, who's really good and very much involved in community health issues. He had to call the head of Ontario to find out whether I had to go into quarantine because it was a second person removed from a carrier. I was told I'm okay unless I feel sick. I didn't feel sick. So I was okay. But then that was the week before. And then it was at Hamilton. And then we had Purim, which, we probably shouldn't have had. But we didn't know then. Then we canceled Shabbat. And again, assumed that we would be back in a couple of weeks. And of course we weren't. But the very first, we had one Shabbat prior to the cancellation. I believe it was the Shabbat after Purim. I don't exactly remember if it was the before or after. I think it was the Shabbat after Purim. But we already put a lot of restrictions in place. That's when we abolished no shaking of hands. We weren't yet requiring masks because people weren't requiring masks at that stage of the pandemic. That took a few weeks for that to happen. Masks weren't yet in place. But we were saying, and we said we did have social distancing, I think. We went from 150 people to like 35 people in Shul that first week. We made it a shorter service, which continued. The trend continued, of course. But it was really depressing because we lost 2/3 of our crowd. So we're back to that smaller number now. And we want to rebuild that number, and it's going to take time. And we're not quite there yet. In other words, there's a new variant every 5 minutes. It's another letter of the Greek alphabet that we're all speaking Greek now. But it's at some point, we need. But I take what Anna's saying. I think you're right. I don't think we're going to go as far as Beth Emeth. I don't think we'll close down Zoom during the week that quickly. Again, not my decision, but I suspect we'll keep it on. But find a way to try to be more encouraging of people to be in Shul. It might be, for example, that maybe Michael's been giving aliyot by Zoom, which, by the way, is pretty radical liberal. A lot of conservative shuls are not doing that. But it might be that he will decide, and the decision will be made once we can have safe minyanim in Shul, with larger minyanim, and we open up daily minyanim, that if you want an aliyah, you have to come to Shul. Maybe that's a possibility that we'll debate the line there. Again, I won't be making it, but whoever makes the line, that's a possibility. So it'll be interesting to see. We don't know how it's going to evolve. One of the questions I wrote down in my notes for today was how do we envision a shul? What's the shul going to look like in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years? And the problem is, and I wrote that down, and I said, we don't even know what it's going to look like in 2 months. It's, we can guess, but we have no idea. I think I like to imagine, I hope, and I pray that it will be closer to what it was. It'll never be exactly the way it was, with some improvement. Because again, as I said, we were considering bringing in cameras prior to the pandemic. I do think, and maybe you can convey this, maybe there's some board members here, I have no power anymore, Beth David. I think we need to upgrade our live stream capabilities. I think we need better cameras, better technology. But that's, I'm sorry to offer an opinion like that. But again, I have no influence. I mean, I'm not, I'm sort of an observer in this kind of thing right now. But overall, I think that's going to continue. But I do hope, and there will be a growing, progression of bringing things back. I'm hoping, by the way, that our next session, which is not till February, I only did 2 sessions now. My hope is that our February 24th session will be hybrid. That's what I'm projecting, God willing, that we will meet in Shul, and we'll also offer Zoom for those. We'll do both. Zoom for those who are not comfortable to come. If it's safe to be in Shul, we'll meet in Shul and even have a cookie or two. But I can't guarantee that. We have to see. That's my hope. We're talking 2.5 months from now. I set up the schedule 2 months ago, so it was 4 months away. Now I'm not as convinced that we'll be able to go hybrid and we'll have to stay Zoom, but we will still always have the Zoom component. I hope that we can bring some semblance of class back into the building. Not totally my call, of course, but we'll see how it evolves. That's my dream and my hope, that we will be able, for some of us at least, to be in the same room together, probably masked, but who knows where we're going to be then. But I suspect there'll be no, Janice, don't worry, we won't have shields, no barriers, and we'll try to be simchadik. We, of course, will be simchadik if a lot of us can be in the same room, because it's been much too long. And we have to get fully dressed, though. We have to not only wear shirts, we have to wear pants and not track suits. I'm wearing a nice shirt and track pants right now. I'm sorry for being very honest with you. At least I'm wearing, but I won't be coming to Shul in track pants. I'll have to wear real clothes, like real pants. But that's the goal. That's the hope. Who knows? I'll see if there are any other comments, questions, or comments. Something good. Wave, or just let me see a hand, or do a virtual hand if you can. It's hard to. Let's see. Or just call out if I'm not seeing you, because it's, I'm getting old. My eyes are not what they once were. Okay, but feel free to interrupt me. I'll make a couple of parting comments, and one will be that, I alluded quickly to the place of Israel in the Jewish vision, because we focused on synagogue, but I really titled this post-pandemic Judaism. So let me just go into one other aspect of this that I didn't go into in my preliminary discussion, because that the Suissa in the end of his article mentions this, and I cut out. I didn't do the whole article. It's much longer than what I presented. I thought it was a superb article. But one of the things that he does, and also in the book that I highlighted last time, We Love Dead Jews, by let's hold it up so you can see it. Yes. So I mentioned last time Dara Gold's wonderful book, where she ends up. And if any of you, by the way, you all should, if any of you subscribe to, let's find it. I had it here, and I don't know what I did with it. If any of you get tablet, which you can get on email, some of you may get tablet. Hopefully I'm seeing some recognition here. There's a piece by my teacher, Ruth Weiss, who's always amazing. Actually, maybe in either Mosaic or tablet. And she talks about Dara Horn, this book. Dara ends up talking about how she has managed to cope during these times of challenge. And she's not a person that is really into Shul per se, but she got into Jewish study. She got into Daf Yomi, the daily Talmud study page. She talks about how that has kept her connection alive. So there are other ways, and that's something that you can do virtually. You can get in study groups, and that works really well virtually, and we're doing that now, kind of. And the later sessions that I've planned with you are largely going to be more study than what I did tonight and 2 weeks ago. But that's something that we can continue to do. I know Michael is offering study, Marshall is offering a study also, and there are many other opportunities elsewhere. That's something we can continue to do. Learning is a way of connecting. It doesn't have to be through only through prayer. But again, the synagogue can become in its ideal situation, that house of study, that Beit Midrash, the house of study, as it is the Beit Tefillah, the house of prayer, but primarily the house of gathering. So let me see if there are any other questions. You're also quiet. It's always a good sign or a bad sign, No one looks like, when I'm on I was on a Zoom conference yesterday, and they stay busy with different things. And there were like 150 people, 180 people on this conference. It was all rabbis. And I can always tell, I always like, when I go through I look at the faces, and I can always tell who's checking email. And I just do it as a curiosity. And especially when there was one really boring presentation. And I would say of the 150 people that had not darkened their screens, there were about 50 who had darkened their screens, so you couldn't see what they were doing. Out of the 150, 144 were checking email. And I was looking at them. I wasn't listening to the lecture because it was boring. But you can always see, and so what I'm saying is I'm looking at you and no one seems to be checking email. I'm like, maybe you don't get email, maybe it's because you've already checked it. But I'm very impressed that you're all watching and you're all focused. That makes me feel better. So I'm not being upset that you're not that you're not asking 400 questions, but that's okay too. That's okay too. I'll do one fast scan and see if there's anyone else who wants a parting question.
All right, I have to get.
Oh, Paul, thank you. I was waiting for you. Go ahead.
At the risk of sounding like an activist, I somehow I find myself on quite a few lists, and I get quite a bit of email from mainly conservative shuls or leadership from conservative shuls, and everybody's grappling with this issue, of course. And everybody's sharing ideas about where this might go. But as Rabbi, like you said, you can't predict the future and what's going to happen. But to some extent, I think that we can control it. And I urge people to express their views and their preferences to the leadership in the shul. Because if we don't express that preference, then the leadership is going to make decisions on their own. And sometimes they make decisions that are not so popular, as we have seen. So I encourage people, every shul is going to end up doing their own thing. And the leadership will make that decision strictly on their own, unless we make our preferences known and let them know. It's a decision that really needs to be democratic and reflect the will of the shul and its membership, rather than just a small handful of people who are in present leadership.
Well, I mean, I appreciate the comment, and I will take it outside of the Beth David circle. But I'm just talking more in general terms. But I think your point is very valid. The truth is that basically nobody knows what they're doing. No one, to say it colloquially, we're all flying by the seat of our pants. Nobody knows what they're doing in terms of leadership, and that goes to major institutions, and it goes to synagogues, and it goes to our synagogue. So I think you're right. It's important to get that, express that feeling, express that opinion. I know that the shul sent out a survey this week. I applaud that. I mean, get opinions out there, and there was a good response, I understand, to that survey. And I'm not going to offer any opinion on the potential merger that Beth David is considering. I will not touch that with a 1,000-foot pole. But again, that kind of, in a way that one has to view something like that. The only comment I will make about that possibility is that one has to view it on many levels, and recognize and deal with it not simply as a solution to COVID-19 issues that have come up and the challenges of the moment, but also the idea of how it works when you bring together two very different communities. And that's tough. I mean, I think it might be a great idea, but I mean, there are people who are here tonight. I came to Beth David. Thank you, Janice, and thank you for being with us tonight. I came to Beth David, I believe it was 3 years after the merger of B'nai Israel Beth David and Beth Am congregation, when they switched the Beths around because it didn't sound good to say B'nai Israel B'nai Israel Beth David Beth Am, so they didn't want two Beths in a row, too many Beths in a row, so they made it Beth David B'nai Israel Beth Am, although most people continued to mix up the order for a long time. But that was tough. I mean, I think it's taken a long time. I mean, and no criticism of either side. There were still people who really found it difficult to be part of a different community because they wanted to be part of the community they were part of for 40 years. And I wasn't involved there. I was still in rabbinical school when this merger happened. I was already a fait accompli. But if I were to criticize those leadership of 45 years ago, the one decision that I think was a mistake was the decision that Beth Am would continue to have segregated high holiday services. And so I was really astounded when I discovered that when I got here as the assistant rabbi in 1981, that the Leah Poslan service was the Beth Am service. That delayed integration by about 15 to 20 years, I think, because most people only come to Shul on the high holidays. Be honest, I mean, realistically, that's 80% of our, the vast majority, those are the days they come. A smaller number come other times during the year. I remember making Shiva visits 20 years ago, to people who were happy members of our Shul who had never been in the Yeoman's Road building, ever stepped into the building. So that was, I think, even though there was a comfort level desire. So were there to be a merger, my advice is not solicited here, and I'm probably not wanted, and I would not, give it too willingly for that reason, because I understand that it has to be, I have to be careful about where would be to not to repeat that. In other words, look for integration as quickly as possible, because it's very easy to remain isolated communities for a long time. By the way, the example of what happened with Beth David and Beth Am was replicated in American communities. I visited a shul in Cleveland 20 years ago, very good shul, big shul. It also was a product of a merger. And the shul that merged into that shul was called Beth Am. So it was like, it was almost like a parallel universe. And the original was, Beth Yeshurun was the large shul, and a slightly smaller shul, Beth Am, merged with it. Not only did they have separate holiday, they had separate daily minyanim.
Oh my goodness.
So you have to imagine that one of the minyanim was at 7, the other minyan was at 7:15. Not to give like we did 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock, an early minyan and an executive minyan, to have two separate minyanim for people, which was totally integrated because people didn't go based on, they went because if they like to get up early, they like to get up later, whatever, they had to run to work or they didn't have to go to work. So that, but to make, the minyan was 2 minyanim because they wouldn't daven together. So thank God, the one thing I have to say, the good news about what happened 44 years ago in our community, was that people, they liked each other. There was no hostility. It was just the decision was made to not to be together, which I think was unfortunate because and then gradually, by the way, that began to break because then people who were originally Beth David people began to go to Leah Poslan's, or especially when it went to Richmond Hill, because people who lived in Richmond Hill or Thorn Hill decided they wanted to, drive 10 minutes to Shul and not 40 minutes. Good decision. So that, that made the decision easier. But so that's why what one is talking about when one talks about, it's not simply ideology. There's no issue really between these two congregations, but it's going to be a need to bring together two communities that are distinct communities that they didn't grow up with each other. They don't all know. There is some overlap, of course. People have family in both congregations. That's, we have people who left Beth David and joined Beth Tikva and vice versa. So there's people who have connections in both shuls. I have friends in Beth David, so clearly I know there's no, but no matter what, there's still different groups, different cultural groups, and social integration is important. Just because we know a synagogue is a Beit Knesset, it's a house in gathering, and it largely becomes a gathering where there's comfort zone. So also, by the way, one of the challenges of people who moved to Toronto from other communities, I was one of those people many years ago, but I came via New York. One of the people, when people move, it's often difficult to break in because one of the things about the Toronto community is such a great community, people never leave. These days, some people live, but some of your kids have left and some of your grandchildren live, but the vast majority of Toronto Jews live in Toronto. Maybe they live in Richmond Hill and not Thornhill anymore. Maybe they live they went to downtown where their grandparents lived. They live there and they moved back to the old neighborhood. And the parents now are in Thornhill or something, but the vast majority of the generations remain in Toronto, which is totally unlike the American experience. But what that means is because people have been here for their entire lives, it's difficult for people who come new to really break into that community. And people have a hard time. And I have to say, by the way, one of the really nice things about Beth David is that it's a friendly congregation. My reading of that history, because I'll tell you, when I was new here, when I came in the summer of 81, I began my job August 1st, 1981, a long time ago. I moved in June. I was here 6 weeks before my job started. So some of those weeks I came to Beth David, but I purposely, when I wasn't working, I decided to visit other shuls. I won't mention them by name, but I went to other large shuls in the neighborhood that I could walk to. And I was like a corpse. In other words, absolutely, there was no human contact with anybody. No one said Shabbat Shalom, nothing. People walked by me. And there was I felt really unwell. I felt really alone. When I came to Beth David, and by the way, no one knew who I was then when I came to Beth David in June of 1981, because I wasn't a rabbi yet, and most people didn't know who I was. Shabbat Shalom, are you new to the community? I was welcomed. So that to me was a star in the camp of Beth David B'nai Israel Beth Am, and I welcomed that. It wasn't perfect, but it was there. I did not feel I was not ignored. In 3 other shuls that I visited, I was, and by the way, even 3 years later, when I'd go to another shul on Shabbat, they didn't know who I was because I was still relatively. It takes a long time to get known in the community. Very, unless somebody knew me, I'd say Shabbat Shalom, I'd say Shabbat Shalom and walk away. It wasn't that, and I would have to fight to say Shabbat kind of thing. It wasn't, so we have to make sure that if that's to happen, that there be, a really concerted effort to bridge that gap of separateness and bring the community, and that's really tough. It's really tough, and so one has to, and that's one of the real challenges. It's no ideal. Davening you'll figure out in 5 minutes. Ideology and ritual policy is very similar. That will take a minute and a half to adjust. That's not the problem. The problem is going to be social integration, and it ain't easy, even when communities like each other. And that was the history here 45 years ago. And again, I visited a community where they didn't like each other. I don't think that would be the problem here. So it's a tough. So that's part of what we need to rebuild in synagogue. Even without merger, we need to rebuild, Cheverschaft, the community, and that's really the tough part. Getting davening back in place won't be that difficult. And those things, the tough thing is going to be, rebuilding a sense of community that gathers together and likes each other and wants to be together and wants to spend time together physically, one person next to the next person. Okay, so now I've gotten I see some comments now that I've gotten almost, not totally, but a little bit off topic. Sharon.
Let me see if I'm unmuted. Hi. I was just thinking of what you were saying, Rabbi Scheim, and I think that because you're no longer here, like with us in the sense of a pulpit rabbi.
It sounds very ominous.
And there's a good, yeah, and Michael and Marshall are phenomenal, but we still want a rabbi there. At least I'm going to talk for myself, but I think other people too. Rabbi Grover, if this is the case that is going to come forward, is a wonderful rabbi. I know him because I've met him a few times at the Beth Tikva. And I think if he was in our shul and he's bringing his people in, they would feel more comfortable integrating. You know what I mean? because they have someone that they already know up there. It's not like you're going to a strange building and all of a sudden, like you're looking around and saying, oh, let's stick together.
Then the question becomes, and again, I'm offering no opinion here, and this is way above my pay
Yeah.
grade in terms of those decisions, but the challenge then will be for him to get to know the Beth David people, for that integration to take place. And I'm not saying it wouldn't, probably wonderful, but again, these are decisions that I know haven't been made, and I again, it's way above my pay
So
grade.
nothing's been
I would
decided
never in a
yet.
million years
You're right.
comment on personnel, on specifics like that. But you're right. I mean, that does help in a certain
It
extent.
helps a little bit.
But it
Like having an
it's still,
uncle or somebody
but a lot
at
of it's not,
somewhere.
as much as I love to emphasize the importance of rabbis, it's layperson to layperson. I mean, Beth David's reputation of being a welcoming congregation wasn't because of the rabbi. They may have liked the rabbi, may have liked the cantor, they hated the rabbi. It was because the person in the pews, not the person on the beam, but the person in the pews that they were going to be seated next to wasn't ignoring them. Or they would go make them welcome, hi, nice to meet you, Shabbat Shalom, are you new in town? Or, kind of, that's where it really happens. That's where you become a friendly congregation. You can have a really friendly rabbi, but if you have an unfriendly congregation, it doesn't help. It's gar nicht helpful. So, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and it's true, that will be helpful.
Yeah,
That will be helpful. And whoever the rabbi
Helpful,
comes
yeah.
in at, whether it's Jared Grover, he's a nice guy, he's a fellow Montrealer. He actually makes me feel old because he's a good friend of my nephew. So he's a generation younger, so he makes me feel as old.
Right. No, the Beth Davis congregation is very warm and welcoming. There's no doubt about it.
I mean, there's always room to improve.
That
In other words,
Facebook group
it's not perfect,
might feel, but
but it's
I
a
don't know.
lot better than other. There are a lot of examples. One of the, I have to say that, I've, especially when I visit other communities, I can do a lot of comparison. I found if I were to say the most unfriendly shuls in the world were in Manhattan. And I happen to love New York City, but Manhattan shuls I found very unfriendly. Everyone comes, I go to more, when I was St. Kaddish in particular, if I was in New York, I'd go to a minyan. If I wasn't going to be near JTS, I would go often to Chabad. Even it's the only place in the world, if Chabad's not friendly, you're in trouble. I mean, when Chabad, because Chabad, their whole leitmotif is being friendly. In New York, they're not friendly. Gives you the time of day because people are just running to daven. They're going off to work. There's no, and I also found Nebuch shuls in Israel not to be friendly, which bothered me when I was in Israel, especially when I was looking for a daily minyan to say Kaddish, and I'd go to, no one spoke to anybody. Nobody, you came in and you could have passed away in shul. Nobody, they would have walked around you. I found that to be disappointing too. So it's not just, it's some nature of some communities, but I think we do pretty well. There's always room to improve. But that's again, part of rebuilding community after COVID is going to be having to be hyper friendly, hyper welcoming, and making sure that whoever comes really feels loved and wanted and essential to the community. We've done a good job. We have to do a fantastic job in that, in order to rebuild community, because people have to really feel that it's worth being in the building, even though it's much less convenient than being at home. You can't be in your gatkes, you could be that way at home. You can't be like that in shul, hopefully not, that'll be really weird. But basically, it's really important to feel, to be hypersensitive you have to be hypersensitive to, to others, especially at a time. And I think I'm getting a very positive corrective that Elise had positive experience of friendliness in shuls in Jerusalem. So I'm glad that you had a different experience than I did, at least. I'm very grateful for that. And I hope mine was maybe it was just me, I don't know. But, were you going to Orthodox shuls? Because I was only going to Orthodox shuls when I was at St. Kaddish, because there were no daily minyanim in conservative shuls. So I didn't, maybe the conservative ones were more friendly. So I'm glad to hear that. I love this. That's a correction that I love to that I love to hear. So I think I'm going to say good night. I've driven all of you crazy. It has been really wonderful to connect with you this way. And as I said the last time 2 weeks ago, stay in touch. Email me questions. I'll always answer you. I'm still around. I'm no longer, I wouldn't say no longer with us is totally applicable in every circumstance. It means I'm not part of the ritual life right moment of Beth David, but I'm, giving Beth David that space and giving me that space. But I think I'm still available if you need me for any questions or anything else. Stay in touch. And we as a class will connect February. It's February, I had it in front of me a moment ago. I lost it. All these papers here. 1 second.
February 24th.
Thank you, February 24th. Thank you. So,
Can I have a copy of the long articles?
sorry?
Can you
Yeah,
email me
Alan,
the
I
long
will
articles?
send it to you. Send me an email and I'll email it back to you, okay?
What's your email address?
Rabbi@bethdavid.com.
That's the same email address? you
Same
still
email.
have?
They haven't kicked me off. I'm still in the same. I don't know if, and the problem is, thank God I haven't been asked to give that up because I have hundreds of people that connect me in that address and I get all kinds of subscriptions. I have my own private email as well, but to get out, it'll be very challenging for me to so hopefully the next rabbi will be Rabbi Goldstein at Beth, as opposed to, but it'll be very hard for me to give that up only because I've had that email for 30 years and it's very, and people who, a new rabbi taking that email address of rabbi@bethdavid.com will be getting all of my old emails and they won't want that either. On that happy note, wishing all of you well, a safe winter if I don't speak to some of you before. I can't wish you happy Hanukkah because that happened already. But Chag Purim. I hope I'll speak to you before Purim. I think I do. I think the next session is before Purim. I don't have it in front of me, but we will be in
Before
touch.
Purim,
God
it's
willing,
leap
stay
year.
well, stay healthy, and stay safe. And thank you for joining tonight.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank
Rabbi, you could never drive us crazy. No
No.
fear there. Thank you for
Too
excellent
late,
Thank you,
explanation.
too
Rabbi.
late for
Thank you.
that. That
I'll
ship
go.
sailed.
As I say to
Yeah.
my significant other, and so give me permission to say it, that I drive because, but it's not a long drive. I would never say that to you people, of course, because then it would be
You've got a
really
great
long
sense
drive,
of humor.
but you only say
Good
that
to
someone
see you.
Take care, guys.
Nice
Be
to
well.
see
Take
you.
care.
Be well.
You
well.
too.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.